Picture the ancient world, right? We usually think of gleaming marble statues and grand philosophies. But let's step away from that, into the dark, candlelit streets of antiquity. For millennia, we've been handed a very specific story about commercial sex. People call it an inevitable vice, a universal truth. But what if literally everything we think we know about this institution is just wrong? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going on a gripping, chronological journey through 5,000 years of history.
Okay, let's dive into this. You've probably heard the phrase, the world's oldest profession. Well, it's actually incredibly misleading. It makes it sound like commercial sex is just this static, unchanging thing born out of basic human nature. But today, we're going to completely shatter that illusion. What we're actually looking at here is a 5,000-year masterclass in shifting patriarchal power, economics, and religious authority. The reality? The meaning of commercial sex has never been static.
So, our story starts in Mesopotamia. We have these surviving cuneiform tablets from cities like and Uruk, dating all the way back to roughly 2600 BCE. Think about that for a second. These are some of the earliest written records of any commercial transaction in human history. And as historian Gerda Lerner points out, early commercial sex wasn't some chaotic, shadowy vice at all. In these formative urban societies, it was actually an economically rational, legally structured occupation. Women held recognized occupational identities, and get this, they even had legal protections. Now you might be wondering, what about the temples? You've probably heard those legendary tales of obligatory sacred prostitution in ancient Babylon, which were first popularized by the Greek historian Herodotus. Well, modern scholarship, specifically driven by Assyriologist Julia Asante and historian Stephanie Budin, completely debunks this myth. There is absolutely zero unambiguous cuneiform evidence to back it up. Herodotus was literally just projecting Greek cultural anxieties onto Babylonian society. It was a total projection, not reality.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast that emerges in ancient Greece. On one hand, you have the really grim reality of the pornai. The famous democratic lawgiver Solon actually established state-regulated brothels specifically to control male behavior, and he staffed them entirely with enslaved women. But at the total opposite end of this hierarchy were the heterai. These were elite, highly educated courtesans, women like Aspasia of Miletus, who literally hosted Socrates and Pericles for intense philosophical debates. They occupied this incredibly paradoxical space. They were deeply stigmatized, but at the same time, undeniably powerful.
Moving over to the Roman world, the evidence gets super visceral. Take the Lupinaria of Pompeii. It's been preserved in ash since 79 CE. Thanks to the meticulous archaeological studies of Thomas McGinn, we actually have physical testimony of this world. There are over 130 erotic graffiti inscriptions on these walls. They record prices, names, and even client testimonials. It proves undeniably that commercial sex wasn't just hidden away in the shadows. It was fully, openly integrated into the everyday civic life of the working-class Roman.
But of course, the Roman state demanded a heavy price. Registered prostitutes, known as meretrices, had to get an official license. And by doing so, they legally forfeited their rights as Roman citizens. They couldn't inherit property normally, they couldn't marry citizens of rank, and yet, Emperor Caligula happily slapped a formal imperial tax on the trade. And this tax was so insanely lucrative, it persisted for over 450 years. The state publicly condemned these women, all while quietly lining its pockets with their earnings.
As the Roman Empire eventually transitioned into the Christian Middle Ages, we see this really chilling justification emerge. The foundational theologian Augustine of Hippo came up with a paradox that would shape policy for 1,000 years. He basically argued that prostitution was a tragic but absolutely necessary sewer in the palace of society. He claimed that if you got rid of it, unchecked male lust would just destroy respectable society. It was this deeply pragmatic, entirely patriarchal way of justifying state-tolerated sin. Fast forward to medieval Europe. Cities owned municipal brothels. Cities operated them. Then, 1471. A criminal investigation shocked the German city of Nördlingen. 12 women testified. Their words echo through history. They revealed an absolute nightmare. The brothel manager forced them into brutal debt bondage. They could not leave. They could not refuse a client. Beneath the pristine guise of civic regulation laid pure, violent exploitation.
So the crucial point is that this medieval consensus of tolerance simply didn't last. Two massive forces collided right at the end of the 15th century. First, in 1494, a sudden and devastating outbreak of syphilis swept through Europe. It brought a fatal contagion directly into the brothels. Second, Martin Luther launched the Protestant Reformation, and he condemned all fornication with deadly seriousness. That tolerance, it utterly collapsed. Brothels were rapidly shuttered all across the European continent.
Now, halfway across the world in Edo period Japan, an entirely different system was meticulously being constructed. Welcome to the Yoshiwara. It was this enclosed pleasure district, heavily romanticized in those stunning ukiyo-e woodblock prints you've probably seen. The Taiyu and Oiran were brilliantly educated in classical literature and music, but honestly, the art was a total illusion. The women depicted in those beautiful prints were actually trapped in a brutal, inescapable system of lifelong debt bondage, often sold into the quarter when they were just kids.
We also see a truly tragic erasure over in India. For centuries, these highly complex traditions existed. You had the Devadasis, who were deeply respected temple dancers, and the Tawifes, who were elite, highly cultured courtesans in the Mughal court. But then British colonial administrators arrived, and they simply didn't understand the culture. Instead, they forced their own strict, rigid Victorian morality onto it. They criminally reframed these beautiful artistic and religious traditions as just straightforward prostitution, and basically degraded these women's social and economic standing overnight.
Back in Victorian London, the Industrial Revolution was absolutely ravaging the working class. Rapid urbanization led to desperate poverty and literally starvation wages for women working in factories or domestic service. For many, survival became a terrifying calculus. It's estimated that between 8,000 to 12,000 women were forced into full-time prostitution in London alone at any given time. This wasn't about moral decay, it was about raw, desperate economic survival.
And this brilliantly illustrates the vicious hypocrisy that defined the era. Victorian gender ideology was essentially a trap. Society demanded the angel in the house, this model of pure, passive, entirely asexual femininity. And any woman who strayed from this, whether by choice or by sheer force of circumstance, became the irreversible fallen woman. It was an utterly impossible standard. It viciously punished impoverished working-class women who were literally just trying to feed themselves and their families.
This hypocrisy finally hit a boiling point in 1864 with the British Contagious Diseases Acts. Get this, the government started subjecting vulnerable working-class women to compulsory, invasive medical inspections just to protect military men from disease. It was basically state-sanctioned medical assault. Enter Josephine Butler. She launched a fierce feminist resistance against this. She argued that the acts stripped women of their bodily autonomy while leaving the male buyers entirely free from scrutiny. Her resistance really sparked a total revolution in feminist thought.
As we race toward the 20th century, a massive moral panic takes over, and the whole global narrative shifts. In 1885, sensationalist journalism about white slavery completely terrified the public. Now, while real coercion absolutely existed, this panic was heavily fueled by racial and nativist anxieties. Still, it was this very panic that birthed the foundational international laws against human trafficking. It moved from the 1904 agreement right up through to the 1933 League of Nations Convention.
We now arrive at perhaps the darkest chapter in this entire 5,000-year history. During World War II, the Japanese military orchestrated a staggering, government-sponsored system of sexual slavery. They euphemistically call these captives comfort women. Through outright kidnapping, deception, and coercion, up to 200,000 women, primarily from Korea but also China, the Philippines, and beyond, were forced into military brothels. It was militarized sexual violence conducted on a chilling industrial scale. For decades, the silence surrounding these atrocities was just deafening, but in 1991, incredibly brave survivors like Kim Hak-sin finally stepped forward. They refused to be erased from history. Their powerful testimonies ultimately forced the Japanese government to formally acknowledge the horrific coercion used by the military. The resulting 1993 Kono Statement was a monumental landmark, a painfully overdue acknowledgement of state-sponsored trauma.
Moving into the late 20th century, a terrifying new crisis redefined the landscape, the devastating 1980s AIDS epidemic. Initially, public health systems highly stigmatized sex workers. But in response, the very first major sex worker rights movements catalyzed all across the globe. They organized, they demanded action, and they fundamentally forced public health authorities to pivot away from strict criminalization and toward practical, life-saving harm reduction paradigms. It was a massive turning point.
Let's move to and see how this builds into the fierce legislative paradox of our modern era. Right now, the globe is totally split on how to handle this. On one side, you have the Nordic model, initiated by Sweden in 1999. This model criminalizes the buyer to deter demand, but it decriminalizes the seller. On the flip side, you have New Zealand's 2003 approach, which implemented total decriminalization to maximize worker safety and health. It is a profound, deeply contested debate over how best to protect vulnerable people, and it's a debate that's still raging today. And as we look at contemporary international frameworks, like the year 2000 Palermo Protocol on trafficking, an undeniable reality emerges. Today's international sex trade remains fundamentally structured by massive global wealth disparities. It's driven by the enduring legacies of colonialism, unequal migration access, and basic economic desperation. The faces may change over the centuries, but the underlying mechanisms of vulnerability remain shockingly consistent.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer, leaving us with a rather haunting question. Just look back at the timeline we've just traveled. Are we really looking at a static human trait, just an inevitable vice? Or have we actually been witnessing 5,000 years of carefully constructed power? This history challenges us to ask whether we should focus less on the individuals caught in the trade and far more on the ever-shifting patriarchal, economic, and legal systems that built it. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning everything.